This chapter, the fourth, entitled The Restriction of Being, is by far the longest in the book and arguably the most significant. In this chapter, Heidegger explores various key restrictions that the Western mind has placed upon being. These are ways in which the domain of being was restricted or bounded by contrasting being with or opposing it to something that is supposedly the opposite of being. Of course, a little reflection immediately reveals a paradox here. How can anything be opposite to or other than being? Wouldn't it have to be in order to be opposite? And in that case, isn't it just another being and thus not opposite after all? Heidegger approaches several famous, historically influential oppositions between being and something else by attempting to show how each actually reveals to us something about the internal character of being itself. It is because of the way that we have understood being that these contrasts appear to be significant and important to maintain. Heidegger starts off this chapter on the restriction of being by noting that in Western metaphysics, we possess a number of formulaic phrases in which we pair being with something that is opposed to or distinguished from it. We say being and. It has become natural for us to say things like being and becoming, being and seeming, maybe more familiarly known to us as reality and appearance. But Heidegger discusses being and seeming, being and thinking, and finally being and the ought, or again, perhaps more familiar to us, fact and value. But even in their contrast, these terms cannot simply be opposed to being. They also have to, in some way, belong to it. In other words, even to be other to something is to belong to it in some way, as a left-handed glove belongs to a right-handed glove, or yin belongs to yang. As Heidegger writes on page 102, but at the same time we mean in these formulaic phrases something more that somehow properly belongs to being as something distinguished from it, if only as something other than it, other to it. Thus, in this chapter, Heidegger will explore these distinctions between being and some other that belongs to it, allegedly. One upshot of these examinations will be to show that being is not, in fact, an empty term for us. These restrictions of being show it to have a multifaceted determinateness. To start, Heidegger offers 7 points of orientation, as he calls them, to guide the forthcoming examination. And these appear enumerated on pages 103 through 104. First, in being delimited by another, being derives a certain determinateness through this limitation by its contrast. In being delimited by another, being derives a certain determinateness through its limitation by contrast with the other thing that it is supposedly being contrasted with, thereby becomes determinate, more determinate. Second, there are 4 such limitations where being is delimited over against becoming, seeming, thinking, and the ought. Heidegger goes on to suggest 2 possible outcomes that may result from this. He says, quote, page 103, the determinateness of being must be either ramified and heightened or else diminish. Third, these distinctions are necessary. They're not accidental. Heidegger says, quote, what is held apart by them belongs to being originally. It's not by chance, it's not by historical contingency or accident that these oppositions were set up, but rather it's because of something that belongs to being necessarily. Fourth, the development of the formulations for these oppositions developed along with the inception of philosophical questioning itself. The development of the formulations for these oppositions developed along with the inception of philosophical questioning themselves. In other words, they represent or express the course that philosophical questioning took itself. They're kind of the symptoms or the manifestations of that questioning itself. They're not extrinsic to it. Fifth, these distinctions are not limited to philosophy alone. It's not just an in-house concern. They pervade all knowing, all doing, all speaking, whether or not one expresses it in these terms or not. So even everyday thought within Western civilization is governed by the unthought character of these oppositions. Six, these distinctions developed historically in the sequence in which Heidegger will go on to consider them. So being and becoming, and being and seeming, which we will be discussing today in this video, belong to the earliest Greek thought according to Heidegger. Being and thinking, although it did have some expression in Plato and Aristotle, especially came to the fore in modern philosophy, and Descartes would be the key figure here as the initiator of the modern era of philosophy. And then finally, being and the ought, the contrast between being and the practical, being and praxis, especially as this is characterized by moral imperatives. And here, Kant would be the central figure. And then seventh, Heidegger notes that, quoting in the bottom of 104 there, asking the question of being in an originary way, in a way that grasps the task of unfolding the truth of the essence of being, means facing the decision regarding the concealed powers in these distinctions. You see the German wordplay is included there by the translators helpfully. Facing the decision Entscheidung regarding the concealed powers in these distinctions, the Unterscheidungen, and it means bringing them back to their own truth. Well, this is a dark and obscure statement, even for Heidegger. However, if we recall the strife or the struggle that's essential to the coming to presence or unconcealment, i.e. the truth of being, we can catch a glimmer of the point he seems to be making here, which is this. A deeper understanding of being will require seeing how it, being, contains within itself a struggle with becoming, seeming, thinking, and the ought, things which it is neither simply identical to nor simply different from. So I'll say that again, that what Heidegger is saying here is that a deeper understanding of being will require seeing how being contains within it a struggle with becoming, seeming, thinking, and the ought, which are things that it's neither simply identical to nor simply different from. Heidegger begins his examination of the traditional restrictions of being with the oldest, the distinguishing of being from becoming. This is perhaps the most familiar of the restrictions of being. The rationale for it has come to seem almost self-evident. So on the top of page 105, Heidegger gives expression to this rationale in the second half of the first paragraph. What becomes is not yet. What becomes is not yet, or what becomes is not yet. What is no longer needs to become. What is, beings, has left all becoming behind it, if indeed it ever became or could become. What is, in the authentic sense, also stands up against every onslaught from becoming. In other words, not only In other words, only what is not yet needs to become. only what is not yet needs to become. Hence, becoming excludes being, because only what is not yet needs to become. Conversely, if something truly is, it is not in the state of being not yet. If something truly is, it is not in the state of being not yet. So it doesn't need to become, it already is. Hence, being excludes becoming. Heidegger attributes the original philosophical formulation of the distinction between being and becoming to Parmenides. In his didactic poem, Parmenides wrote, this is on 105 through 106 in Heidegger's translation, "But there remains solely the saga of the way along which there opens up, how it stands with to be, for along this way many indications of it are given, how being without genesis and without decay, complete, standing fully there alone, without trembling in itself and not at all in need of finishing, nor was it before, nor will it be someday, for as the present it is all at once, unique, unifying, united, gathering itself in itself from itself, holding itself together, full of presentness." Now, Heidegger glosses this as follows. First, Parmenides' poem is spoken from within being. From within being. In other words, he is not assigning properties to being or predicating things of being. Rather, he's indicating being itself in view of being and from within being. From within this view of being, we must actively keep away and expel all genesis and passing away, all becoming. In summarizing the view of being that emerges in Parmenides' saying of being, Heidegger writes that it is, quote, page 106, quote, "the proper self-collected perdurance of the constant, undisturbed by restlessness and change." That's being for Parmenides. The proper self-collected perdurance of the constant, undisturbed by restlessness and change. In other words, being for Parmenides is essentially constancy. Hence, it is kept away from, all becoming genesis and passing away. Nevertheless, Heidegger rejects the conventional understanding of Parmenides as a supposed champion of being, as opposed to Heraclitus, who was supposedly a champion of becoming, in opposition to Parmenides. Instead, Heidegger alleges that these two great thinkers say the same. They think the same. In fact, all the great philosophers of that era said the same thing, which he says is what made them great thinkers in the first place. They spoke out of the essence of being by historical necessity. At this point in his argument, this claim about the essential sameness of Parmenides and Heraclitus is left largely undefended, merely as a provocative assertion. We'll get a clearer sense of what justification Heidegger can provide for this claim later on. At this point, we turn to the second distinction between being and seeming. Heidegger joins his discussion of the opposition of being and becoming to this other venerable and ancient distinction, which he regards as equal in its antiquity to the distinction between being and becoming, and also, as it will turn out, as we'll see by the end of this video, internally connected with it. So this is the distinction between being and seeming. He begins by claiming, as I said, that the distinction between being and seeming also dates back to the inception of Greek thought. Well, it has become fairly familiar to us. Heidegger thinks that we moderns deeply misunderstand this distinction, or at least how the Greeks thought of it. At first, the distinction between being and seeming seems simple and straightforward. all too easy to comprehend. It's simply the opposition between the genuine versus the ungenuine. Right? What is real gold versus fake gold? Genuine gold versus ungenuine. That's the distinction between being, reality, and seeming or mere appearance. And obviously in this opposition, being, reality, the genuine, takes precedence. We downgrade or denigrate seeming, merely apparent, the ungenuine, as deficient by comparison. Being and seeming appear to be, in Heidegger's term, originally disjoined. Originally disjoined. That is, they appear to be separated and opposed from the very beginning, originally. However, if they are originally disjoined in this way, that only indicates for Heidegger that there is, in fact, a deep unity between the two, a belonging together, like a left-handed and right-handed glove, or yin and yang. For all originally separated things belong together. So how do being and seeming, as originally disjoined in this way, belong together? In order to grasp the belonging together that belongs to the original separation of being and seeming, we need to go back to the inception of this distinction. Heidegger sees a clue to this inception in German etymology, in which the word for semblance, which is Schein, spelled that way, Schein. Shine, this word bears the added meanings of shine and appearance. So you have shine, the shine of something, the seeming or the appearance. The English words to seem and to shine have different etymological origins, however. But in our word appear, right, we talk about appearing or appearance. The appearance has a similar sort of ambiguity. It doesn't contain the idea of a shine in the sense of a luster, but it does have the ambiguity between manifestation and semblance. Appearance can mean manifestation or semblance. So if I say Elvis will be appearing at the Tropicana, I'm using appearance in the sense of a manifestation. He'll be manifesting himself at the Tropicana. But if you say that's not Elvis, it only appears to be, right? It's only an Elvis impersonator. Then you're using appear in the sense of semblance. It's not Elvis, it only appears to be. So that's the kind of ambiguity that Heidegger is pointing to here. And he asks, what is this linguistic linkage between seeming, shining, and manifesting indicate? Heidegger draws a bold conclusion. Seeming is appearing, shining forth, coming to presence. Seeming is appearing, shining forth, coming to presence. The top of page 110, he says, the essence of seeming lies in appearance. It is self-showing, setting itself forth, standing by, and lying at hand. Right? So seeming, in the deeper sense, is appearing, shining forth, coming to presence. Seeming in this perspective means coming to a stand, coming to presence. In other words, the original belonging together of seeming and being is due to the Greek interpretation of being as emerging, abiding sway, coming to a stand, standing out, coming to presence. Okay? I'll say that again because of its importance. The original belonging together of seeming and being is due to the Greek interpretation of being as emerging, abiding sway, or coming to a stand, or standing out from itself, or coming to presence. This reading of the connection between being and seeming points to the connection between the Greek word for being, phusis, of course, and the Greek word for truth, aletheia, which we talked about before, because of course this phusis is precisely the coming to presence. That was the Greek interpretation of being, and then aletheia, normally translated as truth, is, for Heidegger, the unconcealment in which beings emerge and come to a stand. Phusis, the emerging, abiding sway, that which comes to a stand, comes to presence, comes to be at hand, is, he's saying, identical to the seeming to the appearing. So this is coming to presence, we could say appearing or seeming. That's the sense of seeming that the Greeks were pivoting off of when they originally drew up this distinction. Phusis as appearing or seeming. And then aletheia, we'll get to in a second. There is an etymological connection in Greek between phusis and the word for appearing, phainesthai. So you have the phainesthai and phusis, appearing. And Heidegger identifies these terms. The emerging that reposes in itself, or phusis, is the self-showing, the appearing, the lighting up, phainesthai. So being for Greeks meant appearance or standing in the light. Appearance, standing in the light, that was being. That was phusis. It's noteworthy that this notion, as Heidegger understands it, undercuts the modern distinctions between realism and idealism, or objectivism and subjectivism. The Greek view of being cannot be merely realistic and objective, because appearing is always an appearing to. The notion of an appearing that appears to no one is, of course, absurd. However, it's equally true that the Greek notion of being cannot merely be idealistic or subjective, because what emerges and reposes in itself as it lights itself up and appears to stand in itself, coming to be present, this is not something that the human mind invents or projects or constitutes. It's something that is discovered, that is received. In fact, what emerges in appearance as being also does so in truth. And here we come back to the notion of aletheia as unconcealment. What emerges in appearance as being also emerges in truth, also emerges in unconcealment. And Heidegger explains the connection as follows on page 110 at the top. Being essentially unfolds as phusis. The emerging sway is an appearing. As such, it makes manifest. This already implies that being, appearing, is a letting step forth from concealment. Insofar as a being as such is, it places itself and stands in unconcealment, aletheia. Phusis and aletheia are, according to Heidegger, intertwined concepts. These are each only possible if they're posited together at once. Hence, truth belongs to the essence of being. Truth belongs to the essence of being. They are not separate from each other. The bottom of 112, quoting Heidegger, truth belongs to the essence of being. To be a being, this implies to be made manifest, to step forth in appearing, to set itself forth, to produce something. Not being, in contrast, means to step back from appearance, from presence. Okay, so this leads to our first discussion question. What is the connection between being and seeming or appearing? Is seeming the same thing as appearing? Is there an original kinship or belonging together of being and seeming, as Heidegger claims? Is unconcealment the essence of truth? If so, does this support Heidegger's claims about how seeming belongs to the essence of being? So once again, first discussion question. What is the connection between being and seeming or appearing? Is seeming the same thing as appearing? Is there an original kinship or belonging together of being and seeming, as Heidegger claims? Is unconcealment the essence of truth? If so, does this support Heidegger's claims about how seeming belongs to the essence of being? Okay, so according to Heidegger, the being of beings is the seeming, appearing, the standing out of concealment. Thus, the manifold of individual beings is understood as what appears, what seems this way or that way, what gives itself an aspect. There is an etymological connection between the Greek dokein, or seeming, and the epistemologically important word doxa, which we usually discuss in the context of philosophy as the word opinion or belief. Opinion. So these are related words. But in order to highlight the connection of doxa with seeming, Heidegger emphasizes a less familiar translation of doxa as aspect. Doxa is the aspect of a thing. The doxa is the aspect that a being shows insofar as it shines forth or appears out of the unconcealment of being. This is the aspect that a being shows when it shines forth or appears out of unconcealment as a being. And such aspects are going to be variable in rank. At the highest rank, Heidegger informs us that, quoting from page 113, quote, doxa means brilliance and glory, unquote, the majesty of God. In fact, this is evidenced by the fact that when the Hebrew Bible translated into Greek, into what became known as the Septuagint, the Hebrew word for kavod, which is glory, is translated as doxa in the sense of aspect. That's in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible used this word. And so we have this phrase, the Christian tradition, the Doxathea, which is the glory of God. It means, and that's doxa here in this sense means glory. The glory of God. So that's the highest rank, of course, of this sort of aspect that presents itself. For the Greeks, to praise the glory of God is to bring into the light, to bring into unconcealment that God has the highest manner of being. For the Greek poet Pindar, such glorification, placing in the light, is the essence of poetry. So this glory, in this sense, is the furthest thing from mere fame and celebrity and popular acclaim, which is what constitutes our degenerate modern sense of glory often. And this misunderstanding of glory as celebrity and popular acclaim leads thoughtless new atheist types to mock God as being insecure and needy because he seemingly needs to have constant acclaim and affirmation. But that's based on a misunderstanding of the Greek term. For the Greeks and the Christians of antiquity, to speak of the Doxathea wasn't just to heap sort of empty acclamation onto God, but it was to bring into light the aspect of God, God's highest manifestation of being. And now doxa is also closely related to the look or view of things, which is its idea in Greek. So the aspect and the look, these are going to be related notions. The eidos, which is commonly translated as the idea, is related in this constellation of concepts as the look that the aspect of something presents to an observer. So this has actually, you can see how this would lead to a view of doxa as opinion, as a kind of derivative notion, because when we take a view on something based on how it looks to us, it looks to me like the suspect is guilty, right? That's my doxa, that's my opinion, but that's based upon the aspect that has shown itself to me and the view that I take on that aspect. So when we take a view on something based on its look to us, this doesn't necessarily correspond to what the being is in itself. This view is a mere doxa, or assumption, or opinion. For Heidegger, the crucial point to understand the opposition between being and seeming is this: because of the kinship of being and seeming, the Greeks experienced the need to tear being away from seeming and to preserve it against seeming. I'll say that again. Because of the kinship of being and seeming, which we've just gone over, the Greeks experienced the need to tear being away from seeming and to preserve it against seeming. And here's where we come back to the idea of a struggle. There was, in Heidegger's reading, an ongoing struggle at the inception of philosophy between being and seeming themselves. For Heidegger, pre-Platonic Greek classical structure was all about this struggle, this strife, this agon, to use the famous Greek word, the word for contest. The agon or contest, which aimed to wrestle being out of beings. The famous image, of course, of what we now know as Greco-Roman wrestling, right? The Olympic Games, the wrestlers struggling with one another for dominance. This is the image that Heidegger is going for. Pre-Platonic Greek classical structure was all about this, classical culture rather, was all about this struggle, this agon, which aimed to wrestle being out of beings, and to separate being and seeming. So he mentions the gods and the state, the temples and the tragedies, athletic competitions and philosophy. We're all concerned with this struggle between being and seeming, which was a struggle for being. Evidently, these all represent for Heidegger the winning of being, these cultural forms, the gods and the state, the temples and the tragedies, the athletic competitions and philosophy. They all represent a winning of being out of a struggle with seeming. But he doesn't explain how or go into detail just yet here. With Plato and his conflict with the sophists, however, something changed. Heidegger says on page 116 that semblance was explained as and thus reduced to a mere seeming. And the concomitant or flip side of this is the elevation of being to a supersensible realm. In other words, Plato introduced a chasm between being and semblance. If, to stay with the metaphor, the pre-Platonic, pre-Socratic culture of the ancient Greeks is best represented as a struggle. It's like two wrestlers, being and seeming, and struggle with one another, and being striving for the prize of being able to establish itself as the victor over its brother, so to speak, namely seeming. When you get to Plato, what you have is being, as it were, being ensconced on the top of Mount Olympus, and seeming being sort of exiled from the city. Right? There's a chasm separating these two. Thus, it seems that Heidegger would agree with Nietzsche in The Birth of Tragedy that a major shift in the understanding of and attitude towards semblance occurred between the pre-Socratics and Plato. In the former thinkers, the pre-Socratics, semblance or seeming was respected as a positive and essential element or dimension of being itself, one that needed to be struggled with, to be sure, but not one that was to be disowned or dissociated from being altogether. In Plato and in later Christianity, being was to be dissociated strongly from semblance, and a chasm set up between them. Semblance was not to be struggled with, but conquered and expunged from being. Heidegger seems to think that the older attitude, the attitude of the pre-Socratics that kept up this struggle between being and seeming, was the attitude that acknowledged the oneness and conflict between being and seeming. And this is portrayed powerfully in Greek tragedy. To demonstrate this, Heidegger undertakes a reading of aspects of Sophocles' Oedipus Rex. In Sophocles' Oedipus, Oedipus begins the play in the most preeminent position imaginable for a Greek. He's a recognized savior and sovereign of his people, and he's reputed to be the wisest man alive. He ends the play in the most dramatic reversal in all of tragedy as the most abject person, in the most abject position, most horrifying position imaginable for a Greek, as the exiled outcast murderer of his father and defiler of his mother. Heidegger interprets the path which leads Oedipus from the one point to the other as a unique result of the struggle between being and seeming. And it's kind of an allegory, you might say, for his people's struggle between being and seeming. It's not that Heidegger thinks that the drama of Oedipus was a drama in which there was just a sort of unmasking of Oedipus. It's not that Oedipus was not what he seemed to be at the outset. He really was the wise and glorious savior that he seemed to be. However, there was something else concealed about him at the outset, namely that he himself was the murderer of his father Laius, and that the savior of his people was also the one who apparently brought the curse of a plague upon Thebes. So there's this identity and conflict in the essence of Oedipus himself. Now, Oedipus, the main action of the play is an Oedipus seeking out the truth. Oedipus has a noble duty as well as a personal passion to solve the mystery of what is causing this plague in Thebes, to unconceal what has been concealed, to solve the mystery in that sense. He seeks above all sight, specifically insight, to see into the concealed regions of being. However, the successful performance of this duty and the fulfillment of this passion that he has, the successful attainment of insight, ironically leaves him blind by his own hand because he's unable to endure what he is what has been unconcealed. And Heidegger reads this as a kind of allegory, as I suggested, for the Greek form of Dasein, or existence itself. He writes on page 117, towards the bottom, of that form of Greek Dasein in which this Dasein's fundamental passion ventures into what is wildest and most far-flung, the passion for the unveiling of being, that is, the struggle over being itself. He goes on to quote a line from Herderlin that Oedipus has one eye too many. Oedipus has one eye too many, which he associates with the characteristic Greek passion for knowledge and science. So we might ask, in what sense is this one eye too many? It's conventionally said that the tragic hero errs, that he is subject to error, especially self-deception. The very happening of unconcealment as an appearing or a seeming, a shining forth of being, contains a risk of self-deception. Page 119, Heidegger explains as follows. He says, at the bottom of the page, 119, seeming belongs to being itself as appearing. Being as seeming is no less powerful than being as unconcealment. Seeming happens in and with beings themselves. But seeming not only lets beings appear as what they really are not, it not only distorts the beings whose seeming it is, in all this, it also covers itself over as seeming, inasmuch as it shows itself as being. Because seeming essentially distorts itself in covering over and distortion, we rightly say that appearances are deceiving. This deception is part of seeming itself. So being as unconcealment, as truth, is a seeming. This is what we've established. This is the essence of being. Being as unconcealment is a seeming. That's its essence. But as a seeming, it's inherently prone to deceptiveness, and in a twofold way. One, it distorts the beings whose seeming it is, and two, it covers over this distortion so as to seem authentic, whole, complete, genuine, natural. Thus, appearances are inherently deceiving. Deception belongs inherently to seeming. And this suggests that Oedipus's one eye too many was his ability to see not only the unconcealment of beings, but also what remained necessarily concealed, namely the necessary deception that belongs to all beings, insofar as it is a seeming. There is, Heidegger says, a space that opens up in the interlocking of being, unconcealment, and seeming. And this he calls errancy. Errancy is the space that opens up in the interlocking of being, unconcealment, and seeming. That's errancy. In other words, there is in being a standing possibility or proneness to error that is the result of the proximity between being and seeming. Because there is such an intimate relationship between being and seeming, they constantly pass back and forth between one another and into one another. Being passes into seeming, and seeming passes into being. It was a recognition of this difficulty and danger that led the ancient Greeks to focus so much of their attention on keeping these separate and distinguishing them. being and seeming, which want to pass over and, as it were, reverse roles with one another. This effort at keeping them separate and distinguishing being and seeming was, according to Heidegger, the chief effort of thinking at the inception of philosophy. This leads to a second discussion question. Is Heidegger's view about the interlocking of being and seeming one that implies the opening up of a space of errancy in this sense? How do you interpret this notion of errancy? Is Heidegger saying, for example, that all knowledge of being is doomed to error? If so, what is the nature of such error, which Heidegger suggests is intrinsic to being and truth themselves? Is secure truth ever attainable? Or is the errancy that belongs to being inevitably going to swallow up any pretensions we might have to final truth, as his own tragic error eventually swallowed up King Oedipus? So the second discussion question, is Heidegger's view about the interlocking of being and seeming one that implies the opening up of a space of errancy? How do you interpret this notion of errancy? Is Heidegger saying, for example, that all knowledge of being is doomed to error? If so, what is the nature of such error, which Heidegger suggests is intrinsic to being and truth themselves? Is secure truth ever attainable, or is the errancy that belongs to being inevitably going to swallow up any pretensions to final truth, as his own tragic error eventually swallowed up King Oedipus? The proximity and unstable flow of being, seeming, and not being lead to three paths of questioning or knowledge seeking that present themselves to every human being to whom being opens up in the way it did to the ancient Greeks. Page 121, Heidegger writes as follows of these three paths. He says, top of the page, if they are to take over their Dasein in the clarity of being, humans must bring being to a stand. They must endure it in seeming and against seeming, and they must tear away both seeming and being from the abyss of not being. The human being must distinguish among these three paths and accordingly come to a decision for or against them. All right, so we have three paths, which I'll just describe as of questioning or knowledge seeking. First, the path that brings being to a stand. Second, the path that endures being in seeming and against seeming. And third, that tears being and seeming from the abyss of non-being. So those are the three paths of questioning or knowledge seeking. The path that brings being to a stand, the path that endures being in seeming and against seeming, and the path that tears being and seeming from the abyss of non-being. All three of these paths presented themselves to the Greeks at the inception of philosophy. Thinking at the inception of philosophy meant the laying out of these three paths and making decisions about them. Parmenides recognized these three ways, according to Heidegger, in the form of what we might simplify as a way of being, a way of not being, and a way of seeming. Right? So that's the way Heidegger laid it out, but Parmenides discussed three ideas of these paths. For Heidegger, Parmenides further saw that the way to being is unavoidable, the way to nothing is inaccessible, and the way to seeming is always accessible and traveled, but it can be bypassed. So let's look at these three statements. So the first statement is the way of being is unavoidable. What does that mean? This means that the way of being is unavoidable. Questioning can only inquire into what is unconcealed. What is closed up, what is concealed cannot be questioned about. Or we might say only the known unknowns, only the known unknowns can be an object of inquiry. That is, the things we know that we do not know. The unknown unknowns cannot be asked about because we don't know to ask about them. So let's take an example. Detectives in the late 18th century in Scotland Yard knew that they didn't know whether their suspect, who was a Polish barber named Aaron Kamiński, they knew that they didn't know whether Aaron Kamiński was the infamous serial killer Jack the Ripper or not. They knew that they didn't know that. That was a known unknown. They knew that they didn't know that. But an unknown unknown was for them whether Kamiński's DNA matched bodily fluid found at the scene of one of the murders. That was an unknown unknown for those Scotland Yard detectives of the 19th century, because they didn't know enough to know that they didn't know whether the DNA matched. That wouldn't become a known unknown until the late 20th century, and it wouldn't be known until, in fact, last year, 2019, when the mystery was solved through DNA. In short, the way of being, this first way, is unavoidable in the sense that we're limited to what is unconcealed in our questioning, in our search for knowledge, to the known unknowns. The second statement Parmenides makes, though, is that the way of nothing is inaccessible. The way of nothing is inaccessible. What does that mean? If being is the unconcealed, then not being or non-being is what remains in concealment, closed to our questioning. It's not pure nothing, but only nothing to us. It's outside of our purview at any particular historical moment. Or one might say that there's no distinction from the perspective of our Dasein, from the perspective of our lived existence, between absolute non-being and the utterly unknown, the unknown unknowns. In the way I just laid out, it's possible for us to recognize the category of unknown unknowns. I hope you recognize it and understand what I'm trying to say. So we can have the category of the unknown unknowns. It's even crucial for us to do so. And that, I think, is the point of emphasizing the way of nothing is nonetheless and still an important path. Because to do so, to recognize that there are unknown unknowns, is to keep our inquiry open-minded to new revelations of being, new events of unconcealment, and thus humble in its overall attitude. However, this does not make the way any more accessible to us. Merely knowing that I don't know what I don't know is no help to my inquiry at this point. It doesn't help to know, so to speak, philosophically that the concealment of being still exists. I'm still absolutely in the dark about what is concealed from me. So the way of nothing is inaccessible, but nonetheless, it's a way that must be acknowledged and reckoned with. The third statement of Parmenides is the way of seeming is always accessible and traveled, but it can be bypassed. The way of seeming is always accessible and traveled, but it can be bypassed. In this context, seeming means opinion, doxa, the beliefs or views or assumptions that people hold about things that are due merely to the aspect of those things that show themselves to them. So the way it looks to me, my views. This way necessarily is partial and inadequate. And the seeming that shows itself here is not to be equated with being, but to be kept distinct from it. This way naturally leads to a philosophy that traffics in conventional wisdom and accepted common beliefs and worldviews rather than the unconcealment of beings themselves. Now he says this way can be bypassed, seeming can be bypassed. So in what manner can it be bypassed? Is he saying that we should avoid it as a wrong road to take? Or on the contrary, is he saying that, well, it is inessential, it can still be taken without any harm ultimately being done? Or is it in some sense essential, but in an indirect sense? Could it possibly be beneficial? Heidegger actually writes about this way as a constant and urgent need, as he says on page 125. And this suggests that for him, it is beneficial and even needful. How is that? Heidegger writes on page 124, quote, "It is all the more needful to know this way as such," that is, to know that the way of seeming is a way, "so that being may reveal itself in and against seeming." In other words, traveling along the way of seeming has something to teach us, namely the very intimacy between being and seeming, and the danger of their confusion that this poses. Learning this lesson, we can remain on guard against this confusion, while at the same time learning to appreciate how being is tied up with seeming. Heraclitus, moving from Parmenides to Heraclitus now very briefly, Heraclitus expressed the opposition and internal relation between being and seeming in his fragment, which is translated by Heidegger as follows, quote, this is quoting Heidegger quoting Heraclitus, "Being intrinsically inclines towards self-concealment." Being intrinsically inclines towards self-concealment. This is a famous fragment that is more often translated, "Being loves to hide." Being loves to hide, or nature loves to hide sometimes. And there's a book I would like to recommend to you on this by Pierre Hadot called The Veil of Isis. The subtitle is An Essay on the History of the Idea of Nature. Excellent book. It ends up with a chapter on Heidegger discussing the history of this idea that being loves to hide itself. And this is an important point for Heidegger. Heidegger points to how being inclines towards self-concealment. On page 126, he says, "Being means to appear in emerging, to step forth out of concealment. And for this very reason, concealment and the providence from concealment essentially belong to being. Such providence lies in the essence of being, of what appears as such. Being remains inclined towards concealment, whether in great veiling and silence, or in the most superficial distorting and obscuring." In other words, there are three ways in which being can be said to incline towards concealment. Since its essence is unconcealment, this means that concealment also belongs to that essence, as its provenance or origin, as what unconcealment is drawn out of. There can be no unconcealment without a prior concealment. So concealment also belongs to the essence of being in that way. Second, being has an inherent tendency to be drawn back into concealment, to become veiled or silent. That's the second way in which beings can be said to incline towards concealment. And then third, being has an inherent tendency, because of its essence as appearing seeming, to be distorted or obscured as a mere seeming, in the way that Parmenides warned about, the confusion of being and seeming. Okay, well finally, Heidegger draws a connection between the oppositions between being and seeming on the one hand, and the opposition between being and becoming on the other. And he explains this as follows. This is on the bottom of 126 and continuing to the very top of 127. What maintains itself in becoming is, on the one hand, no longer nothing, but on the other hand, it is not yet what it is destined to be. In accordance with this no longer and not yet, becoming remains shut through with not being. However, it is not a pure nothing, but no longer this and not yet that, and as such, it is constantly something else. So now it looks like this, now it looks like that. It offers an intrinsically inconstant view. Seen in this way, becoming is a seeming of being. So this is an important passage. I urge you to read it over carefully yourself several times and to drive your own conclusions about it, where he's equating, or not quite equating, but explaining the interlocking kinship between the opposition between being and seeming and the opposition between being and becoming. The explanation that Heidegger gives here depends upon a bridging of the difference between becoming and seeming with the notion of now looking like this, now looking like that. Now looking like this, now looking like that. That bridges the idea of becoming, because becoming is interpreted in this way as now looking like this, now looking like that. And of course, seeming is contained in this idea of looking like. However, it's important to note here that this is only a bridging between becoming and seeming. It doesn't erase the fundamental difference between becoming and seeming. Even as Heidegger asserts that, quote, becoming is the seeming of being, and seeming and appearance are the becoming of being, on page 127, he also insists that these formulations are not intended to be reductive ones, but rather they're explanatory in some other way, apparently. He concludes that the question of the relationship of these two separations must remain open for now. So, for our third discussion question, let us consider this. Third discussion question: how does Heidegger's long, multifaceted analysis of the opposition between being and seeming help to shed light on how being and becoming belong together? Does his discussion of semblance shed light on how Parmenides and Heraclitus say the same thing about being, or think the same thought about being, perhaps? At the end of the day, is there actually an intimate relationship between the distinction between being and becoming on the one hand and being and seeming on the other? Does the bridge between these two oppositions have the character that Heidegger suggests, namely the character of being a bridge based upon the notion of the look of a being? So once again, third discussion question: how does Heidegger's long, multifaceted analysis of the opposition between being and seeming help to shed light on how being and becoming belong together? Does his discussion of semblance shed light on how Parmenides and Heraclitus think the same thoughts about being? At the end of the day, is there actually an intimate relationship between the distinction between being and becoming on the one hand and being and seeming on the other? Does the bridge between these two oppositions have the character that Heidegger suggests, namely of being a bridge based upon the notion of the look of a being?